Hello everyone, welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host Cole, and today I'm taking a little break from performances. I built up a bit of a store of recorded performances before the new year, but I ran out, and I've been so busy with all my usual work since I got back home after my break that I haven't quite had the chance to finish any new recordings. So I'm going to take this opportunity to continue my long discontinued series on my top 10 piano influences. If you haven't seen them yet, be sure to check out my other videos on famous pianists of the past that I really think you should check out. I have videos on Alfred Cortot, Wanda Landowska, Vladimir Horowitz, and Sergei Rachmaninoff, as well as George Bullitt. I almost forgot. Today, though, we are looking at a very unusual artist who was exactly the opposite of the above-named figures in every possible way, Sviatoslav Richter. Richter was a little younger than the other musicians I've covered so far in this series, except for Bullitt, of course. Richter was born in Odessa in 1915, and he had a rather extraordinary background. His father was a German-born composer, pianist, who was unfortunately killed by the Soviets during the Second World War, and his mother was the daughter of a noble Russian family. The name Richter is obviously more Germanic than Russian, and I think the kind of split heritage was something that surprisingly manifested in many ways in Richter's playing. Although he was still very much interested in a beautiful sound and color, which of course are hallmarks of the so-called Russian school, at the same time there's a kind of austerity and uncompromising musical logic, which I associate with the more Germanic school. But these of course are just generalizations, so let's actually get on to the man himself. It might seem fairly obvious to include a name like Richter in this series. He tends to be found on many lists of greatest pianists of the 20th century, but as I mentioned, from my own point of view, Richter was the polar opposite of most of the pianists and musicians I had been drawn to in my younger years. At that time, I was very into artists who typified the Romantic tradition of the 19th century, and at first I really didn't like Richter's playing very much. To me it seemed a bit cold, a bit too ordinary and prosaic, especially when you compared it to the kind of freewheeling, lushly stylized playing of Russian-born pianists who had received their training prior to the 1917 revolution. I mentioned Rachmaninoff and Horowitz, of course, and also characters like Benno Moiseiwitsch and Nikolai Metner come to mind immediately as well. From the pure standpoint of philosophy, I can still say that I am pretty much at the polar opposite from many of Richter's dictums. Many of them are hilariously funny or moving and striking, as the case may be. Richter felt, for example, that you should never try pianos before a concert. He believed in always leaving it to the tuner to make the instrument ready. I think that this did result in a very inconsistent piano sound sometimes in his live recordings. I much prefer getting to know my instrument and selecting it if possible, and even working with a tuner on voicing is a great idea if you have the chance. One of the biggest points that I disagree with Richter about is his statement about the performer's relation to the score. Richter felt that the performer should be a mirror of the score, not adding or taking anything away from the performance. And it is perfectly true that Richter almost never alters even a single note in any of the scores that he plays. He doesn't even add embellishments to Mozart or Bach, as would have been common when the music was written. In this regard, he was part of the new objective school, which really flourished after the Second World War. The school of the Urtext, if you will, in which the composer's word was law, and the letter of the law had to be followed first. The spirit came as it could, kind of limping along behind. This is a school of thought which I don't really have very much sympathy for. I generally find exponents of this approach to be too rigid and intolerant of creativity, too ready to shirk off their responsibility for the musical result in performance onto the printed page. At the same time, though, Richter was such an unusual personality that even with his philosophical insistence on the letter of the law, he created things of such transcendent power at times that it was hard for me not to be won over. So I got more and more interested in getting to know his playing, and I think the turning point was when I finally watched the documentary about him that was made by Bruno Monsajon. It's called Richter the Enigma. If you haven't seen it, I really do recommend it. It's fascinating, also very sad. But it was in this documentary that I first began to have an inkling of what was so very special about Richter and his playing, even if his style was very far then and now from my own. Now, of course, what usually impresses people first is the physicality of his playing, the pure kind of animalistic energy. And of course, I was impressed by that as well. That would have been enough to really make me so interested in his playing. I think what really captured me was the way that he could sustain extremely slow, diffuse music in a really unique way. Excerpt was from Schubert's G major piano sonata, and it absolutely entranced me the first time I heard it. I had never before encountered anyone who could do anything like this in slow tempos. I still have never encountered anyone who I felt really sustained incredibly slow tempi in quite the same kind of successful way. To many people, this style of performance probably seems insane. I know later in college, many professors that I talked to expressed a marked aversion to Richter's playing, especially in works like this one and the B-flat major sonata by Schubert. But you only have to check out the comment section under this particular recording on YouTube, and you'll see that this performance continues to have a striking effect on many people's imaginations. And I always wondered, why is that? Just to give you a little bit of context, the G major sonata is one of Schubert's longest. I believe it was kind of a trial run for his longest sonata, which was the B-flat major. That sonata also starts with this kind of equivocal, not quite slow, not quite fast first movement. Typical recordings of the G major sonata run between 36 to 39 minutes, usually. Richter's performance takes 45. And the first movement is what accounts for that. It's the only one that he plays at an unusually slow tempo. In fact, the last movement is even quite a bit faster than what you usually hear in performance, so that probably slightly offsets the number. So getting past statistics to the nitty-gritty of what it is that's going on in Richter's performance that's so fascinating, I think really it boils down to the question of rhythm. If you try to analyze what he's doing here, if you try to count along with Richter's playing of the opening theme, you'll find that it is impossible to count steadily. Richter very slightly shortens the long notes, and he dwells lovingly on the moving eighth notes. This is the opposite of what people usually do in this opening. Most people extend the long notes. They're probably worried about cutting them short, actually. And then they kind of move through the eighth notes a little bit faster to make them into one gesture instead of individual notes. So let's compare the segment that we already heard Richter play with a very different performance by Alfred Brendel. So if you rewind the video and you try to count along with Brendel's version, it's much more straightforward. He's obviously subdividing the opening chords at a very steady pace, and then he pushes ahead very slightly on the eighth notes. So if we were to count it, it would be something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and so forth. With Richter, we get something different. It's more like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, or something like that. So it's quite an extraordinary difference. Brendel is what you usually hear, something like this approach, and Richter is very much the anomaly here. I don't think I've heard anyone play it quite like that, although I'm sure there must be some other eccentrics out there who play this really slowly, but I'm not sure if anyone plays it in this kind of uneven way. Of course, there's nothing wrong with doing this opening the normal way, but I was kind of struck myself by the way in which the effect of this music becomes much more ordinary, even prosaic, when it's played in the normal way. Somehow we expect it. It kind of plays into our instincts. Whereas Richter's version has an element of surprise. He's really playing this opening as a free fantasia, out of strict time. And this plays into an aspect of Richter's philosophy, which I really agree with. He spoke sometimes about the need for finding the unexpected in music, finding some way to make music which people may have heard many times reach the audience in a visceral way. There was one striking method that he had, for example, at the start of the B minor sonata by Liszt. This sonata starts very softly with bare G octaves and a low register of the piano. Before starting, Richter would walk out on stage, put his hands on the keyboard, and then hold himself absolutely motionless for a slow count of 30. He said this created an extraordinary kind of tension in the audience, uncertainty, as they were waiting when was the first note going to happen. And that tension was only relieved after this long pause by the first murmured G. So I don't think it's simply that Richter couldn't keep a steady tempo or that he couldn't count or subdivide the long notes. I think he was actually being guided by his feeling for the emotion behind each harmony. His instincts, in fact. The opening chords, which represent our home base, are played with a lighter feeling of carrying across the bar, and the eighth notes, marked with dots and slurs, are played more with individual weight and this kind of pathos of expression. And for a lot of people, that pathos may seem exaggerated, but for me, it results in one of the most moving realizations of this opening page that I've ever heard. It's extraordinary to me that Richter's way of playing this completely contradicts his philosophy. he's not being a mirror of the score here. He's deliberately distorting the rhythm to an extreme degree in order to obtain a certain kind of effect. However, for me, this contradiction between Richter's performance and his philosophy is exactly what caused me, way back then, to like his playing after all, and to gradually become, grudgingly, a real fan. Now, the question remains, does this interpretation, so beautiful by itself, work in the context of the entire piece? And this is a little harder to answer. I mean, it's subjective. There's no real right or wrong answer. I suspect that for many people in the audience, whatever they felt about Richter's interpretation, whether they agreed or not, they were probably very powerfully affected in an instinctive way, just as Glenn Gould was when he heard Richter play the B-flat Schubert Sonata. Yeah, Gould didn't even like Schubert, but he walked away from that concert with a feeling that he'd experienced one of the great musical events of his life. The problem with Richter's Schubert G major sonata is that it's very hard in our modern society, with all of our distractions, to reconcile ourselves to the patience necessary to allowing this music to have its effect at that tempo. If you were in a concert hall, that would be a little bit easier, but it can still happen even when you're listening to this low-quality version on YouTube. It really impresses me with the strength of Richter's interpretive grip that it can still have this effect through such an imperfect medium. So I'm going to ask, if you are of a scientific bent of mind, to please perform a little experiment for me. Set aside 45 minutes when you have no distractions, go to a quiet room, run the music through some good speakers, and listen to that complete performance of Richter's G major Schubert Sonata interpretation. Try to keep an open mind and free yourself of any preconceived notions, and just let the music play on you and see what happens. Then please come back and leave a comment and let me know what you thought of the experience. So that's all I have for you right now. I want to thank you very much for watching this video. Please do consider supporting the channel if you can. All your donations help me measurably to continue bringing you this content. One easy way to make a lasting impact on the channel is to sign up for monthly donations at www.patreon.com/independent pianist. But if you can't do that, then please just like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned next week for some more great music and conversation.